Welcome, everybody. Aloha. Welcome to here. You are joining us today for the third and final event in the 2021 Earth Month Lunch and Learn series. We've been gathering at 12 noon for the last 3 Fridays to hear from different members of our community, beginning with Na'alehu Anthony 2 Fridays ago, to consider our kuleana in times of huliao. Last week, we heard from Dr. Keith Cross, or as he prefers to be introduced, Keith Cross, MC, PhD, AKA Dr. Bars, one of UH Manoa's finest faculty members, and we explored learning from ancient stories to navigate climate futures through hip hop. And today's session is entitled Responding to the Climate Crisis with Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. We have one panelist who is caught in a obligation that has gone longer than anticipated, and so she will be joining us as soon as she is able. And in the meantime, I'll just cover a little bit of housekeeping as we give folks some additional time to log on as well. We're really glad that you chose to spend your time with us here today, so welcome. I guess let's begin just with gratitude for the opportunity that we have to be here in this cyberspace with each other today. And I'd also like to remind us all that, conversations about sustainability are always conversations of privilege, because it's really only if we are fortunate enough to have all of our basic needs taken care of and are not in immediate physical danger that, we have the privilege of contemplating these essential and existential questions around sustainability. As last week's Lunch and Learn guest, Dr. Keith Cross, reminded us, and I quote, "The white man's fragility rising is likely to kill me before rising sea levels." That was especially pertinent on the heels of the jury verdict for the George Floyd murder trial last week. So let's just acknowledge that we have privilege. We all have privileges that we carry into the space, and we're fortunate to be able to be here today. And for that, I am grateful. Today's presentation is going to be done in webinar format. Bear with me, I'm a little bit new to the webinar format, so I'm still getting used to it. UH Manoa Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Design Team member and current PhD student Pua Souza will be assisting us to host and moderate the questions that you can submit during the second half of our time together using the Q&A feature in this webinar format. Thank you, Pua. Thanks for being here. Our purpose here today is to listen and to hear stories which may help us to understand why healing is needed to respond to the intersecting crises of climate change, social inequities, and racial injustice, and other crises that are facing our communities, so that we can begin to explore our own roles and responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, and to our places, especially in light of the scale and magnitude of the scale and magnitude of the challenges that we face during these times. And as a result of participating in this session, our hope is that you'll have an opportunity to hear personal stories from colleagues who are learning and growing through the reflective practices we cultivate in our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation practice. We're hopeful that you will have an opportunity to practice cultivating your own reflection and listening skills as you listen to our stories, and maybe find some points of connection to help discover our common humanity. And we also hope that you have an opportunity today to consider the interconnections and root causes of climate crisis, racism, and other isms. So we're going to share some personal stories today, and we're going to invite you to lean into our practice of cultivating reflection through this listening practice. I also want to say that we don't have all the answers. So what we're sharing today it's sort of reflective of like how we're making sense of things to date in our ever increasing complex world. And I think we'd all like to acknowledge just, how much more we have to learn and grow in this. We're scheduled to go to about 1:30 today. Well, we are scheduled to go until 1:30 today. We want to be respectful of your time on a Friday. And the session is also being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for later viewing. And we'll be sure to send that out as well. So with all that being said, I'd like to formally open this session and begin with a land acknowledgement. And Monica, would you be so kind?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. On behalf of UH and today's presenters, I welcome you and respectfully offer a land acknowledgement. My name is Monica Stittberg, and I'm speaking to you from where I live in the Ahupua'a of Kahalu'u, in the Moku of Ko'olaupoko, on the Moku Puni of Oʻahu, in the Paeana of Hawaii. I am also taking up space at the University of Hawaii Manoa campus, where I work and have an office. And the Manoa campus is in the Ahupua'a of Waikiki, in the Moku of Kona, on the Moku Puni of Oʻahu, in the Paeana of Hawaii. I acknowledge that where this campus sits is on stolen land, and that Native Hawaiian families were evicted and displaced from that land. I myself, I am a white settler here in Hawaii, and I acknowledge the damaging consequences of settler colonialism in Hawaii. I recognize that generations of Native Hawaiians and their indigenous ancestral knowledge systems have shaped Hawaii in sustainable ways that allow me and many others to enjoy these gifts today. For this, I'm truly grateful. And I seek to support the indigenous peoples of Hawaii to protect their land and their communities. And I am committed to dedicating time and resources to working in solidarity. Wherever you are today, because each of us, we exist on land, not only in this virtual cyberspace. So I'd like you to acknowledge where you are by looking out a window or a door and taking a breath and sensing your connection to the place you are in. I ask that we honor all Native Hawaiians, the ancestral descendants of this Aina, as well as honor the indigenous peoples of the places that you are in as you watch this. Mahalo anui. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Monica. Great. So I'd now like to invite our team to introduce ourselves to you all. And perhaps Pua, I'd love to invite you in to do so.
Aloha mai kākou. I'm Pua Souza. I'm from Honamaka'u, but currently live in Kaimuki. I'm a PhD student at the College of Education and currently work as a graduate research assistant at Kamakuku Kalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. And I'm really looking forward to listening to everyone's stories today and connecting with them. So aloha.
Mahalo. Siobhán, would you mind introducing yourself?
Aloha, my name is Siobhán Dhonacha, and I grew up in Dublin, Ireland, so that's the place that shaped me. I live in Makiki, and I have an affiliation at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the UHM Honors Program, which is an undergraduate program, as a faculty specialist. Lovely to be here. And I'll turn it back to Matt.
Wonderful, thank you, Siobhán. Monica.
Thanks. As I said, I currently live in Kahalu'u. Before that, a place that had shaped me is where I grew up, which is in Michigan, in the Holland Grand Rapids area, which I know now, but I didn't know then, is the native lands of the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Peoria peoples. And I'd like to share a quick, just so you get to know a little bit more about where I live. I found this old saying about kahalu'u, which is just a spot on description, and it's ua poai hale o kahalu'u, which means house surrounding rain of kahalu'u. And it's raining here right now, so it's a spot on description. I am a specialist in the Assessment and Curriculum Support Center at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Monica. Thank you for sharing that story. Our third panelist is Makana Reilly, who is on her way, and I'll invite her when the opportunity permits to introduce herself as well to all of you. My name is Matthew Kamikoni Lynch, and I grew up on the shorelines of Kaneohe Bay, which really profoundly shaped me. I'm coming to you today from my home office in Kaimuki, and I currently serve as the Director of Sustainability Initiatives for the University of Hawaii system. So in a moment, I'm going to invite our panelists to share some more of their personal stories. And right now, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to set us up with some context as to why we share stories. And so I'm going to do that by actually sharing a little bit of a story. That's how I got into this work. So in 2017, I received a call from Dr. Kaivipuni Kawikweku Laip asking me if I wanted to partner with her to apply to become a campus center for truth, racial healing, and transformation. Kellogg Foundation had put a call for proposals out to colleges and campuses across the United States in response to the racial violence that had happened in Charlottesville earlier that year. And let me tell you, when I said yes to her invitation, I really had no idea about the personal journey of learning that I was about to embark upon, and the growth that was ahead for me, and that I'm still in the midst of. A major focus of my work over the past few years has been to partner with the office that she leads, the UH Manoa Native Hawaiian Place of Learning Advancement Office. And through this work, I've really come to understand that we don't need to heal ourselves so that we can do the work of responding to climate and related crises. Healing ourselves is the work. Today, our species, Homo sapiens, is faced with multiple crises that are fueled by a deep disconnect from the laws of nature that allows us, or has led us, to see us as separate and apart from nature. And this has led to vast inequities, to a dysfunctional and a destructive relationship with each other and with the natural world. For example, Oxfam reports that the world's richest 10% produce half of global carbon emissions, while the poorest half contribute only 10%. And US News reports that 97% of waste produced in the US is corporate waste, and that 80% of these businesses are owned and operated by white folks. The American Journal of Public Health reports that Black communities are exposed to 56% more pollution than is caused by their consumption. The world's wealthiest 16% owns 80% of the world's natural resources, and just 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global emissions. And while Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the planet's population, they are responsible for stewarding and protecting 80% of our biodiversity, according to National Geographic. Race and racism seek to disconnect us from ourselves, from each other, and from our Mother Earth. This false notion of you and I being separate and apart from each other and from our Mother Earth can be understood as the root cause of so many of the crises that we face today. We are not separate and apart from this planet. We are a part of her. And therefore, when we heal ourselves, we begin to heal her. And a virtuous cycle is in place. When we establish relationships and connections with specific places, we can be unified in our relationships to others, to be in service to our places, and begin the healing that is so necessary in these times for ourselves and for our planet. And so to begin our sharing of stories today, I'd like to invite Siobhán to start us off by sharing her story.
Mahalo, Matt. Oh, dearest, sweetest, boggy land, I left because I hardly knew you. I left because in truth, I did not know I could stay. I left because I was already far away. Oh, sweetest, earthy, mossy place, I wish now to stare you in the face and the belly, legs, and head. Laying softly on my bed, my heart full of lead. How can I speak to you when I never truly learned how? Is it too late to wade in with a wide smile and a pair of wellies, mumbling about in the generous green, rarely known, rarely ever seen? Welcome us home, all like me and many more. Let us begin again our interrupted, sweet, boggy history, and end all that misery. Let us bring home the seed of love to plant and grow amongst the trees of sweet Irish leaves and true Irish ways. Let us find the Tallav land together. Let us touch the clouds that shroud our ancestors, the pure hearts of our collective selves. Let us cry now so that later we will, Gaira, laugh. An awful, awful, awful lot. And let us hope we will then never stop. This is a story of connection in the face of disconnection and living in one's truth. I want to share with you all a poem that I wrote about the Tallav ʻāina land to give a concrete example of how the Tallav ʻāina land lives in our souls as Irish people and how poetry remains a healer to this day. Growing up on the island of Ireland, nature was a constant heartbeat, smelling the air to see if rain was coming, watching the clouds to gauge how heavy the rainfall before getting on the bicycle, seeing the boga boscha, anue, and all the different names we have for that, going to see the fresh catch at Dunleary if the family of 9 could afford to once in a while, and contemplating the gentler foamy seas was part of everyday life, even for a city dweller like myself. I was lucky to grow up within walking distance of Sandyman Strand before gentrification, which was a haven for many. As you may or may not know, Indigenous Irish people traditionally express ourselves in poetry, dance, singing, and music, which has nurtured us through surviving centuries of colonization. In Irish culture, especially Druidic, the bard was the warp and weft of the weave of society through oral history and genealogical storytelling. This is so resonant here in Hawaiian traditions and culture. Tallav land is essential to our relationship to life in all ways. Even as that land was no longer ours, laws were made about the Tallav that Irish people were not the originators of, and for-profit crops were planted for export. This resulted in disastrous famine conditions for disenfranchised Irish people, renting the use of their own land in tiny parcels that could only sustain one non-Indigenous crop. Indigenous ways of stewarding the land were cast aside and violently interrupted. Forced migration is part of my life story and many others in Ireland and across the globe. The effects of colonization based on socially constructed racist ideologies disconnect people from place and are long-lasting and harmful, especially harmful for the land, which unconditionally houses all of us. I feel this in a deeply personal way. In reality, what we all do on land in each moment is what we give to everything around, above, below, and next to us. I've always seen this world and each society I live in as a connected web that is affected by each of our choices and actions or lack of actions. And yet I was almost entirely disconnected in my own birthplace from my own cultural clan, Mo'oku Oʻahu, genealogies, and Kuleana, resulting responsibilities. My parents are an example of this. One was born in Derry City and the other in Dublin City. One spoke Gaelic almost fluently, the other did not, as that was not an option in Northern Ireland. Therefore, our family lost connection and relationship to a shared culture and ancestry in our own country. When a language is deliberately erased, so is that culture. Living in Hawaii, the history of the Hawaiian kingdom was new to me, but not the story of colonization and racism. Neither was active advocacy new to me as an out gay person choosing to live authentically. The act of coming out is an act of healing and is a continuum asked of gay people every day. However, what was new was becoming a respectful student of Indigenous Hawaiian culture in the place I am so fortunate to now live in any way that I could while juggling full-time employment and postgraduate degrees. I chose courses in my PhD that taught me about the history of education in Hawaii. My PhD is in education, the different waves of colonialism and settlers, and created a section in my PhD devoted to the study and discussion of Indigenous mentoring, as my PhD had a component focused on mentoring, which was based on primary source Hawaiian materials and interviews with a number of kumu. This section was entitled Mentoring is Not a Western Invention. And I like to say that nothing is. Connection and care drive my work and life, nestled within an active sense of place. For example, I embed Hawaiian worldview, Indigenous curriculum materials, and speakers in all of the courses that I teach, especially when teaching research methods and approaches. Kuleana is responsibility, inaction, and relationship. And once I was taught about Kuleana, I can now actively practice that in my daily life. I feel so fortunate to have a kumu in my life to teach me this. Learning from the teachings of TRHT, I have now been given the tools to experience a profound reconnection with my own culture and a profound opportunity to respect, embrace, and be a student of the Hawaiian worldview, pathway, wisdom, and culture in direct relationship to place here in Hawaii, our community Ohana, and the Aina Native land. Over to you, Monica.
Oh, thanks. I know my name's Matt, but I'm going to jump in just a second here. Thank you, Siobhán, for sharing such a powerful story about the ways that racism and settler colonialism had disconnected you from your place and from yourself, and for sharing some of the ways in which you're cultivating your own healing. You said something that really stuck with me. You said that the act of coming out is an act of healing. And, you know, as we were preparing for today's session, you'd also said something to the effect of truth is a healer. And that once you had embarked on your journey of telling your truth, that you found it was a natural gravitation for you. You gravitated towards truth and activism your entire life. And it's just such a powerful example of the power of that truth telling, you know. You also said that we can't actually heal if we're all dead from the climate crisis in our prep session, which kind of reminds me of what some of the things that Keith and I were talking about last week. And you know that this, like, if, yeah, we can't heal if we're all dead, seems so obvious, right? But it's a point that's somehow lost, that I fear is lost in today's rhetoric of fighting climate change. We have to fight climate change. And I guess something I've been, you know, wondering about is if climate change is anthropogenic, that means that we humans have created it. So if we're fighting climate change that we've caused, doesn't that mean we'd be fighting ourselves? And especially through this work, I've been wondering a lot about what it might look like if we, instead of this relentless focus on fighting something that is out there, we started instead to focus on healing and on healing ourselves, our damaged relationships with ourselves, with each other, and with our places, instead of this obsessive focus on fighting with ourselves, with each other, with our planet. So thank you, Siobhán, for your commitment to authenticity, to truth seeking, and to cultivating relationships that are life affirming and nourishing. And I'm going to invite Monica to share her story with us in just a moment. Makana has actually joined us during Siobhán's story. So Makana, would love to open up a space for you to introduce yourself to our group today.
Yes, thank you so much. My apologies to everyone for running a bit late. I was stuck in a board meeting. There I am. And I'm really excited to be here. And thank you, Matt, for including me in this presentation, and pass it along to Monica. I'm sorry, am I supposed to share about myself or no?
You did the perfect segue over to Monica. She's up
Okay,
next.
rewind back to the segue to Monica.
Thanks, Makana. I'm so glad you could join us. I'm so glad that that made it possible. And Siobhán, you know, you had shared your poem with us earlier and I had read it, and then hearing you say it, that was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Loved it. So I'm going to share a story with you all about how some of my actions and my academic training led to me being initially disconnected from Hawaii as a place. And thus, for too long, I actually did not see the need to understand and connect with Native Hawaiians, their history, and their culture that continues today, even though I was living here. So I had moved to Hawaii after I finished my bachelor's degree in English from a university in Michigan. And I am of European ancestry. And as a new arrival to Hawaii, I decided to read about Hawaii in travel accounts written by people like Mark Twain. And I noticed in these stories that, you know, the Native Hawaiians were being described using negative terms and images. And a couple things really stood out to me, but one that I wanted to mention today was the depiction of Native Hawaiians as lazy. When I had read this many years ago, I wrote this off as racist writers, and coming from writers who were products of their time. And I thought to myself, you know, I've identified this language as racism, as racist. And I personally don't think that's true about Native Hawaiians. So good for me, right? Good for me. And as I think back on that, I realized that was pretty naive of me, but you know, that's where I was at the time. And I have a really much different understanding now. So when I reflect back, I realize that my categorizing and my writing these things off as racist actually accentuated and perpetuated this disconnect between me and the place I was living and the indigenous peoples of this place. It really kept me at arm's length. Over time, as I continued to live here in Hawaii, I started connecting the dots. I started, you know, making connections between that wrong-headed idea that Hawaiians are lazy with racism, colonialism, and the climate crisis. And I'm really glad that I learned how I might take action, because by not taking action for all those years, in essence, that meant that I was agreeing with those negative depictions of Native Hawaiians. And I was perpetuating this devaluing of Native Hawaiian culture and wisdom. It really was the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center's work here at UH Manoa that helped me turn a corner to finally undergo this transformation, if you will. Because as I learned about intergenerational trauma, educational colonialism, and some ʻŌlelo, like for example, haloa, and how haloa is the taro, and kaikoana, the elder sibling, and how caring for the Aina as a family member is so crucial. learning from that story, that mo'olelo, that it is a kuleana, a responsibility and a privilege to care for the Aina, which will in turn feed and care and nourish us. That's what I took away from that. And so now this corner that I've turned, so I've moved from being able to name things as racist or identify settler colonialism, to understanding the dire consequences of intergenerational trauma and the consequences of treating the Aina as if it were only a resource to take from and to own. That, as we all know, has contributed to the climate crisis. And now today, I'm able to find ways to take action. So I'd like to share with you a couple actions that I've taken to be more connected. They are small, but I'm seeing this as a journey, and it's a hard journey and it's challenging for me, and I've made mistakes. I will continue to make mistakes, and I'm very appreciative when people take the time to alert me to my mistakes. So the first thing that I started doing was reading Indigenous authors as part of my work and for my personal understanding. Creighton Litton, a professor at UH, he recommended Braiding Sweetgrass, which is what I've been reading most recently. And the author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a member of the Potawatomi Nation, which is close, that's where I grew up, right? She describes how settlers labeled traditional peoples as lazy and wasteful because these settlers did not understand how Indigenous land care practices included not harvesting 100% of what was available, right? Their practices included safeguarding a sustainable supply for future generations, eye to the future. And she goes on to contrast this with the laws created by the colonizers. So by reading this and other works by Indigenous authors, my understanding was deepened of different worldviews. And also I started to really understand why it is important to not put these different ways of knowing on a hierarchy, but instead treating them as equal. In my professional work, which involves program evaluation and learning assessment, I started reading on Indigenous research methods, and I started attending local and Indigenous evaluators presentations and workshops, such as the KREA Hawaii folks' work. So KREA Hawaii, that KREA stands for Culturally Relevant Evaluation and Assessment, and they developed an Aloha framework for evaluators to use and be guided by when they're doing evaluation in Native Hawaiian contexts. So I've been taking this learning into different areas of my life, into work. And for example, I've been encouraging others to read and to value Indigenous research methods, and also to use Aina-based or place-based classroom assignments for learning assessment purposes. And then, recently I realized that a group I was part of had written these diversity and social justice statements, which was amazing, but then they weren't actually walking the walk, so to speak. And I realized my kuleana, my responsibility and privilege to this group was to alert them, to point this out, and to give them some options that I had learned from my own readings and from listening to Native Hawaiians and others. So I wrote a letter. And I was so fortunate to have people on this presentation panel, as well as the larger TRHT design team, come to my aid and give me feedback and guidance, because that gave me the confidence to actually send that letter. And it was really scary for me to send this letter. And then my letter was not very well received, but that hurt, actually. I had to get over that hurt that they didn't receive my letter well, but I do feel that I have this kuleana to this group, and that tells me to keep trying with them. So to sum up, I've been learning, I've been connecting, I've been forming relationships with Native Hawaiians who have been willing to share their time and wisdom with me, and I'm super grateful for that. And I will keep trying to take action as I keep learning. Thank you so much for listening. I'll turn it back to Matt.
Mahalo, Monica. Thank you for sharing those stories with us, and for sharing so vulnerably, about the ways that racism, settler colonialism, and other isms have disconnected you from Native Hawaiians, like when you first got here, and from the Native peoples of the place that you grew up and shaped you. And also for sharing about how you're taking thoughtful actions to reconnect with Native Hawaiians and with Hawaii. And like if I'm being honest, as we were preparing, when I first heard you share this story, I was thinking, why is she sharing about a bunch of books that she's read? Like that's okay. And I was sitting with that and wondering. And then later I was chatting, with our dear friend and mentor in this work, Dr. Leip, and she pointed out how the simple act of choosing to seek out, read, and learn from Indigenous authors actually reflects like a profound sense of responsibility, like that you understood was your kuleana in this particular situation. You were actively seeking to prepare yourself and deepen your understanding by doing your own homework in a way that did not put the emotional burden on Indigenous peoples for the sake of your own learning. You weren't saying, hey, I realize I got to learn more about Hawaiian stuff. Where the Hawaiians can they teach me? You instead took it upon yourself to do your homework. I'm thinking about some of the genealogies that have shaped me. And for example, in martial arts training, I wouldn't dare ask my sifu a question without first preparing myself and doing all that I could and taking it upon me to learn from my siblings in our practice, to ensure that I wasn't asking a question that was going to wind up getting me put on my butt, literally. So just thank you for like modeling how, simple actions can be quite powerful, and also how powerful it is to act with thoughtfulness and intention. And then, you shared a little bit about your story with your colleagues, with your group of peers. And I think it's really worth, like, you risk something there, and we were talking about this in our preparations also for today, the difference between an ally and an accomplice, right? An ally is someone that says, hey, let's go out on this Friday night, and then accomplice is someone that wakes up with you in the jail cell the morning after. In other words, there's a degree of risk that you're willing to take on. And so thank you again for modeling that in small and big and powerful ways. I'm actually gonna share now a personal story of mine about how I have been disconnected from Aina through capitalism and colonialism. And I'd like to share about some of the ways that I've begun to reconnect to the peoples and places of Hawaii, and even to the peoples and places of my ancestors, so that I can begin to heal from the ancestral traumas that I carry. My family's been living in Hawaii for over 4 generations now. On my mom's side, we originally immigrated from the Philippines to work as exploited labor in the sugarcane and pineapple plantations, which arose after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom on January 17th, 1893. And Filipinos themselves have endured multiple waves of colonization, occupation, and exploitation by China, Portugal, Spain, the United States, and other actors, which has severed, it's largely severed the original peoples of those islands from their indigenous ancestral knowledge systems. And on my dad's side, I'm also descended from islanders. I'm descended from Irishmen and Scotsmen who were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands by the occupying forces of the British Empire, presumably for stealing a loaf of bread to feed themselves or something in their struggle to subsist. And my ancestors from those islands were shipped to Australia as convicts more than 2 centuries ago. They served in the labor camps of the British colonies that were established on the indigenous lands of the Aboriginal people of the Australian continent, who themselves are heirs to more than 40,000 years of the indigenous ancestral knowledge systems of that place. And so I'm sure that I carry ancestral traumas which I may not even be aware of. And these things, these genealogies shape how I show up in the world. And these traumas very likely manifest themselves unconsciously in my reflex responses and behaviors. For example, my body and my mind are deeply shaped by capitalism and colonialism. Let me illustrate. Let me unpack that. I was bullied quite badly as a teenager growing up in white middle-class Australian suburb. And I learned there from my classmates that there was a perceived hierarchy in human value just based on someone's appearance. And in that context, even based on someone's net worth, the amount of money someone had in a bank account. So I was not the norm in terms of my appearance or in terms of our family's worth. So as soon, all the signals I was getting was that I was not valued, that I was worth less. And as soon as I was old enough to get a job, I started working my butt off to make money, so that not just that I would have the option to buy things, but really so that I could prove to my classmates, and even perhaps more sinister, to prove to myself that I was worth something. And obviously this didn't work, as in it doesn't change how I appear in their eyes. I was still perceived as other, as a brown-skinned Asian immigrant who did not belong, or even worse, was perceived as a threat to their own ability to get ahead. And so my response was to double down and work even harder, to, quote, be more productive, to make even more money so that I could prove to myself and prove to the dominant paradigm of society that I was indeed worth something. And you know what? I was pretty successful at the making money part. By age 29, I'd amassed enough assets to create a net worth of over $1 million. And by age 31, I had actually managed to lose it all, but that's another story for another day. But during that entire phase of my life, I had this gnawing feeling that I was an imposter, that someone would find out that I'm actually worth less, you know, that this mixed breed boy who was from everywhere but from nowhere at the same time was not actually who he said he was. And, you know, to this day, one of my primary reflex responses to stress is to double down on my work and to, quote, increase my productivity, because the dominant paradigm of our modern global society, which we are all entangled in, values things like productivity, values things like growth, and values things like capital more than it values life itself. Recently, though, through my own learning and growing in our work together, I've been invited by genealogical descendants of a certain Aina to take on specific responsibilities for very specific places. And those experiences are opening up entirely new paradigms of being in relationship to people in service to a place. We're working to restore the koa and ohia forests of Waikiakua in Mānoa Valley. And through this work, I'm learning to slow down and to observe and to conserve my energy and to pay close attention to what the Aina is teaching us, so that we can respond and act in ways which are appropriate. It's taken us 3 years of observation, thoughtful planning, and a really like joyful collaboration for us to plant 128 Native and Polynesian introduced trees in a single day just a couple weeks ago, to establish a seed bank in the valley that may one day grow into the majestic koa forests, for which many of today's street names in that area are named for. I'm learning to move in more natural cycles, and to act with more attention, and to pay closer attention to how I am nurturing and caring for myself, so that I can take care of the kupuna who have invited this kuleana from me, so that we can take care of that Aina. And it's been so incredibly healing for me. It's almost, it's difficult to find words to describe this new ways of being that I'm experiencing. So Makana, you and I really started to form our relationship through our work together that was in service to a particular Aina, which has been in your family for generations. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to share a story or two about a time when you were disconnected from Aina, whether we're thinking about Aina as a place, or as the peoples of that place, or as both. And perhaps you could also share a little about how you build, rebuild, and heal those connections.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I want to start by sharing out about, you know, I was born and raised in Honolulu and in Manoa, right near those places where you now have kuleana. And in the way that I was brought up, it was very much in the city. I didn't step foot into a lo'i until I was 27, maybe. And I also attended Kamehameha schools, and at that time there was no stepping foot into lo'i happening. And so I spent the majority of my life being disconnected, I would say, in the city and in an educational system that at the time was not promoting connection to Aina. And so in the last 15 years, I'd say, since I got back from undergraduate, I've found my way. I've worked in many different ways intentionally to reconnect myself to places that I do have long-term genealogical connection to, and places that I don't necessarily. I mean, I grew up in Manoa, and I'm, you know, third generation in Manoa, but there's a lot of generations before me that are from Manoa that are not my family. And so recognizing my positionality in different places. And most recently, what's been really empowering has been in the last couple of years, I've taken some time to really research my mo'oku ʻauhau in my family. And I was doing this research. Initially, it was sort of brought on because I wanted to plan out my alama'i, which are traditional tattoos on the inside of a female's leg. And, you know, that was sort of the impetus for starting this research. And it has turned into so much more. I'm now, you know, 2 years in, finally have my both alama'i are done. But it's really ended up empowering me, you know, healing and empowering me. So allowing me to see where the places where I actually come from. I live here on Kauai now, and my lineage tracks back to West Kauai. And so knowing and learning about these names and incorporating them into the design that I have on my body now as a memory, as a reminder, as a lesson to my kids, so that they know who we come from and where we come from. And, you know, now just last week I went up to Koke'e, just at the bottom portions of Koke'e here on Kauai, to pick some flowers. I'm a lei maker. And so I went to gather some a'ali'i, and I'm standing up there in a place where, you know, I've only lived in Kauai now for a year and very much from Oʻahu. And I'm standing up there and I don't feel like I don't belong. I actually, you know, I was looking down at Waimea and Kekaha and Ni'ihau, and I really felt like I belonged. And that to me was the empowerment of doing that research. Was I know that 8 generations ago, I had an ancestor that was from that area, that lived and thrived in that area. And maybe not up in Koke'e where I was, but for sure down in Waimea, and perhaps traversed some of those areas that I was up in. And so that's really empowering. It's been very empowering for me to be in spaces like that, where I have very little tangible connection. I don't know a lot of the people there. Much of my family doesn't live there in that area, but I recognize that I am of that place and that my ancestors are still there, and their traces are everywhere, including in possibly the ʻŌlelo that I was gathering. And, you know, I think that this way that I go about interacting with Aina has also transferred to places where I don't have a lineal connection to. So I'll share about how in my work with Hawaiian Land Trust, I go into spaces and communities where I have no lineal connection and I have no, you know, prior relationships to the people of that place. But it is my job and our position as Hawaii Land Trust to support these communities in potentially protecting certain areas. And so the way that I go about my work and my role is initially to create relationship and trust with the Aina itself. And so recently in a newer project that we're on Maui, I got to visit the Keanai area, which I've never been to before. But I went down with a friend of a cousin, and I worked in the lo'i for the whole day. And I think that on the surface, it's about building relationship with community and the community members so that they trust me and the organization that I work for. But on a much deeper level, in terms of my belief system, it's about creating that relationship and trust with the Aina, that the Aina is going to trust me to come in and do what's best for the Aina, not what's best for me and not what's best for the organization, but for the Aina itself. And so my practice and my belief is that I go to a place and I give of myself, and then I allow the Aina to dictate whether I'm accepted. The community obviously can vocalize that, and the people can vocalize that. The Aina vocalizes it in different ways, kind of like what Matt was sharing. Sometimes it takes a little longer for a project to materialize or move forward, but sometimes that's the Aina's intention. That is the work of the Aina itself. And I think that this humility has really allowed, and this perspective has really allowed me to honor Aina in the highest regard. And it has also empowered me, I believe, to be the one that is honoring Aina in multiple different spaces and multiple different ways. I think I'm going back to you now, Matt.
That was beautiful, Makana. Thank you. I was on your last point, on humility. It made me. You reminded me of Auntie Manu Meyer's axiom, I guess, a saying that she has where she was sharing, you know, I spent my life trying to explain to people what indigenous epistemologies mean, you know. And this is like a, you know, beloved Native Hawaiian auntie from, you know, a well-respected family who studied at Harvard, right, in the pinnacle of the sort of the Western Academy. And she's going, how do you explain indigenous epistemology like as simple as possible? And she's like, you know what? Finally, I landed on love land, serve people. Love people, serve land. And as you were describing that, stepping into service through humility, I was really reminded of that. So it was really resonating. So thank you, Makana, for
Sorry,
sharing.
one thing I wanted to touch on, as I was reminded as you were sharing on that, one other thing that happened, actually it just happened last weekend. I was in a workshop to learn about natural farming, which is so ironic to me that we as Indigenous people have these workshops on learning how to farm naturally. But here we are, right? Decolonizing our own farming. And one of the things that really stuck with me beyond all the science behind it was that the person giving this presentation was sharing that farming is a relationship, right? Food is a relationship. And so, you know, in my relationship with my husband, if I give 20% and I take 80%, how long is that relationship truly going to thrive? And as a farmer and as someone who is expecting food of our Aina, how much do we actually give and feed to our relationship with the Aina? And not just in the sense of getting your feet in the lo'i and putting your hands in, but, you know, even when we harvest, we have this practice, long-term Hawaiian practice is to give back the first of your harvest, right? So my ohana here on Kauai, we make pa'akai. And so anytime we harvest pa'akai, we give back the first handful to the Aina. And fishing, you know, fisher people do that as well. And in the lo'i, I've never done that. And, you know, how much of the food that the lo'i is producing for us are we giving back to the lo'i to feed the lo'i itself? And that was really, I think, prolific for me to think even deeper in terms of our relationship to place and to our food.
Yeah, mahalo, Makana. That's the reciprocity that we are so often working with in the different aspects of our work. Thank you. That was in your stories. I also heard about how you were using you were referring to mo'oku auhau, which is one of the core concepts or key terms, I guess, that in the Manoa's practice of truth, racial healing, and transformation is one of the sort of cornerstone terms that we work with to learn from. And so it was wonderful to hear how you utilize that as a tool that gives you specific guidance on specific strategies and tactics of how to enter a space appropriately. So mo'oku auhau, my current understanding of the term is, it's genealogies, and genealogies we can think of as genealogies of, you know, our families. We can also think about it in terms of genealogies of places, the places that have shaped us. We can also think of it as genealogies of knowledge systems, which I think is especially pertinent for us in the academy to think about as part of a university that's been here for just over 100 years and is one house of knowledge, and thinking about the many houses of knowledge that have been here for many hundreds of years, taking care of this place. So I also heard in your story something similar to what Monica was expressing, how you take it upon yourself to prepare yourself and do your homework before you go in. And then I was really curious when you were at the start talking about how connecting with Aina and listening to and building relationship to Aina. And I found myself wondering, okay, so how do I create relationship with Aina? And then you gave, again, like a simple but profound example of, well, when I showed up in this place that I don't have connections to yet, the whole first day was spent, you know, in the lo'i, caring for that specific place. So thank you for a really rich share. I always love talking story with you, Makana. That brings us to about a half hour left, which is what we had kind of allocated for our Q&A of about 20 minutes or 20, 25 minutes or so for Q&A. So for our friends that are joining us as attendees, feel free to, if you had any wonderings that came up in any of the stories that were shared, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. And as you do, as you gather your thoughts and think about what questions you might want to ask of any of our panelists or maybe of the entire panel, I'd like to kind of bring it back. Like at the start of today's session, I shared that one of our hopes was that we're going to create a space that allowed you to practice cultivating reflection and listening to other people's stories so that we might discover our common humanity. And so that is a key aspect of our work in truth, racial healing, and transformation. And what's interesting about that too is in our stories, we heard how they reveal our entanglement in complex and in often unhealthy systems. And so there's some type of power in naming and articulating this entanglement so that we can have more agency and more choice about how we're going to do in light of that entanglement. And you know, for some folks were sharing with me, like, that's a really, how are you going to connect climate crisis to racism and truth telling and healing? That for many people, that's a really big leap to make. And Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a wonderful author that I'm frankly pretty obsessed with at the moment, and she's written a book called Emergent Strategy. She describes the fractal nature of our work, how our work transcends scales. And so a lot of what we heard today are personal stories of how we are cultivating healing practices for ourselves. So that we can take care of ourselves better, so that we can take care of each other better, so that we can take care of our places better. And Adrienne Marie Brown talks about how the health of the cell impacts the health of the organ, which impacts the health of the body, which impacts the health of our relationship, interpersonal relationship, which impacts the quality of our community's health, and so on and so forth. And you can see how these scales are nested within each other. And in a very real way, what we do at our personal scale matters immensely because we are entangled in this nesting of scales. I actually have a question for the panel. And so we're gonna figure out in real time who wants to take this first. I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to respond if you'd like. Makana was talking about positionality, and she referred to mo'oku auhau. And as I mentioned, that's one of sort of 4 key concepts or terms that we center our work around, or our learning around, in the Hawaii grown version of truth, racial healing, and transformation. And so my question for our panelists is, how do mo'oku auhau, kaikua'ana, kaikana, and kuleana, how do these these concepts help us to understand positionality, or help us to understand and guide us as to appropriate actions, how we can best show up, how what is most appropriate to show up in different spaces.
I guess I'll take a stab. Thanks, Pua, for putting that in the. So it's interesting being at a university for a long period of time, changing roles at a university. So, you know, when I think about when I first started, you know, obviously I was the younger, the kaikaina. And in my field, as I gained knowledge and I spent time, I built relationships. Now my mo'oku auhau, my genealogy, you know, I've moved from just understanding other people's ideas and how they're framing things to now being asked as the kaikaina, the elder now in the field, more of an elder in the field than the newcomers, because I'm still anyway. Now I'm being asked to participate in this generation of information for my field, assessment of student learning. And what is my kuleana now? And how can I do that without addressing things like indigenous frameworks and indigenous ways of being? And so I think now my kuleana is that now that I know this, it's my kuleana to do what I can to share this with others and to speak up for students in particular when they want to do research using methods that their professors might not be familiar with because it wasn't part of my academic training. So, you know, how I see my kuleana as how can I speak up? How can I play a leadership role in my field to value indigenous ways of knowing as equal to statistics, psychometrics, et cetera, right? So I think that's where I'm at right now, and I'm still, like I said, I'm still on the way and still learning, but I feel a lot better now that I'm trying. At least it makes me feel good to be trying and trying to make a difference. Thank you.
Mahalo.
I'd like to add just a little because I feel, Monica, you did a very beautiful job expressing the alive energy of this process. I think of it for myself as articulated gateposts. They're really forming the structure of how I move in this space and place in concrete ways, and working with undergraduates, teaching and advising students. I think forefronting and always raising that awareness, and always being inclusive. And I would really agree with Monica in the sense of I tend to be a little bit, Indigenous knowledge is older than anything. So I really am just acknowledging a fact. So it's turned into something a little bit like you're decolonizing how to be a farmer, or farming methods. Makana, you were saying, it's this irony that we keep going through, but I just think stating the truth, which is how I perceive it, and having the tools from being allowed to be in TRHT and to be a student and to continue to be a student allows me to have a lens, a language, tools. And I think of mo'oku auhau as something that's always a guiding principle, and everything comes from that space. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Mahalo, Matt.
Mahalo. And I wasn't sure if you were ready, but it's okay if there's nothing. You can...
No, it's okay. I'm super excited to hear Monica and Siobhán's perspective, and I don't feel the need to add anything.
Nice, beautiful.
Can I add one more thing? Something I learned from Nicole Bowman, who is an Indigenous evaluator and part of the American Evaluation Association. One thing she taught me recently was that if I'm asked to be on a panel or speak, like for example in this, that the first thing I should do is ask, who are the other panelists? Are there Black, Indigenous, people of color on that panel? And if there's not, can I help you find one? And if that means that I don't need to be there, then that's what should happen. And I think this is something that all people in higher ed who are asked to be on, all white people in higher ed who are asked to be on panels should go through also. Who else is on this panel? Because there are smart people and they have different perspectives that are so valuable. But if we just keep turning to the people who had the privilege to begin with as our panelists, and if those people never say, who else is on the panel? Can I help you find someone? Then we're in trouble. And so to do that actually means you have to start building more relationship building with a wider network to make sure that can happen. So I think that is definitely a kuleana I see for higher ed right now.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. And I know you've shared stories about times where you have done that, and it's such a powerful model.
I'll tag in and riff off of what Monica is sharing. I definitely resonate with that perspective, Monica, and I really respect that you are at a place where you understand your positionality and your kuleana in varying spaces. I'll share that the board of the organization that I work for is comprised of 14 members from across 4 islands. And we recently had a committee meeting. I'm sure this is not public information, but I'll share it here, where we were just confirming that someone was going to take on the chairship in January of next year. And in her response, she said, yes, I have accepted that position for next term, but I would like to say that I accept it with reservations because I would far prefer that a Hawaiian were the board chair for Hawaiian Land Trust and for the work that we do within Hawaii. But if there isn't someone currently on the board who's prepared to take on that chairship, that she was by all means willing to do it. And that really warmed my heart. I really appreciate when someone can recognize their positionality and acknowledge and come in with that humility that perhaps there are even better people that would serve in that position. And I think that I shared with her that perspective and her voicing that concern of hers is huge for the way that we do our work, and acknowledging that, perhaps as chair, she'll extend that, and Monica, kind of to what you're saying, like extending this concept to all of our work, that this idea of, where are the Hawaiians on the staff? Where are the Hawaiians in the community? If we're holding community meetings, where are the Hawaiians? If we're having classes at UH, like, where are the Hawaiians? We're in Hawaii. Where are the Hawaiians at? And I really appreciate that. Thank you, Monica.
Makana, that reminds me of the PICO exercise that we get to experience as part of the TRHT work. And, you know, in some of my work with different Native Hawaiians from different areas, it's fascinating to me how much I've learned about how we'll figure out who is closest to the knowledge, who's closest to the source here. And then because that is understood as that is who it is appropriate to defer to, because they are closest to the source. That's a direct strategic and tactical benefit, right? Thinking about how that expresses itself in boardrooms and in other contexts is really useful. And I was reminded also, Monica, of even your example about the authors that you're reading. And it makes me think of The Uninhabitable Earth was a book that was a straw that tipped me into a pretty deep depression, written by a non-Indigenous, from a non-Indigenous perspective. A follow-up book to that I read, written by Tyson Yunka Porta, who's an Aboriginal practitioner who's decided to enter the academy to experience that. And he describes in his work these similar ways of distributed cognition and of collective deference. It's a deference to, as you're moving through a landscape and you're preparing to cross a stream, if the youngest member in the group is closest to that knowledge, you know, the nephew of the uncle who's been there, the group will defer to the knowledge of that youngest person because they're closest to that source. Yeah, just checking in with the question here. Oh, thank you. Hey, Dr. Kaibupuni Life has joined us and poses a question. This question is for Pua, directed to Pua and to myself. And the question is, related to the PICO exercise by Dr. Noi Goodyear, Kaupua, who is closer to the PICO, but also how do we take care of those people who are closer to the PICO? I'm wondering what the panelists have to say about that. How do we reach forward and reach back in that analogy?
I'll just go real quick. I was thinking that the research is clear that involving diverse perspectives on things like land issues and board meetings, et cetera, the research is clear that the outcome is better. And so knowing this, how do we support those people who are closest? Well, I think the first step is making sure everyone knows that there is no hierarchy of knowledge systems, and that I think we support them. We support those people by saying, we are listening. We value your ancestral knowledge if it's coming from an Indigenous person, right? I think everyone in the room, we support them because they're closer by accepting, acknowledging their special knowledge that will benefit us all.
Thank you, Monica. Siobhán, I'd love to hear your perspectives. I always love listening to you and how you think about these things.
It's very kind of you to say. I believe change has to be visible, and it has to be included intentionally in systems. So it can't just be left up to, if we really, this is my observation over time personally, transparency and inclusion, so that we start at the PICO and not from outside of the circle. So we actually start in the middle. And then we say that we start in the middle, We actually create, and nobody loves policies in one sense, but we do need ways to live with each other that are loving. I would say a loving contract, a social contract that says this is what we're going to do. And if we don't do it, we're going to spend time fixing that. But if we never acknowledge it and then we never create those practices that are not, it doesn't mean there isn't space for intuition and being, but I don't know that we can progress systemically to reorder back to original ways of knowing and wisdom and doing if we don't literally create systemic change that's embedded in what we do in all of our work. I'm working at the university, for example, so I would say at the university level. So we actually do things that follow clear methods that are loving but clear, and that can be actually followed in a way that observes and respects the core Indigenous wisdom, but actually creates enactment. So I'm a systems change, concrete, granular person, because in the end, we have to do that too. We literally have to do that because we've agreed to live this way. Whether or not we all love this, we can change that. But this is how we're living today. And I am a real advocate of that as well. So that's just a perspective I always bring and try to apply to how I do my work, the environments I work in and live in. So I actually try to come away at the end of the day with something that is a genuine, enacted, iterative change that can continue.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just drop off if one person drops off, or it doesn't drop off if it's not reliant on a particular individual having openness or a particular individual wanting, for whatever reasons, to have a particular thing. It's just a basic philosophy and way of acting and being. So anyway, thanks for allowing me to share.
Yeah, and the just to be explicit, like the reason we're centering around Indigenous knowledge systems is because wherever we are, those represent generations, multiple generations of learning of how to take care of and to live within the biophysical parameters and constraints of that specific place. Yeah, you also make me think about, Siobhán, what in service to what? So if we're thinking about it at the scale of maybe economies, to what end are we, how are we designing our economies? Are we designing it to maximize economic activity because that's our primary indicator of well-being? Or are we thinking about ways that we might design our economy to be in service to our lands, to make sure that our lands are healthy so that our peoples can be healthy? So thank you for giving voice to that so we can think about this across the different scales.
Mind if I add one more thing, Matt? When I was in class the other day with our student scholar Hui, we were discussing different elements of research, and students are presenting research. And one thing I discussed with the student scholars was always ask the question, who benefits? Because if something is the way it is, it's because someone benefited and someone continues to benefit. And we have an obligation, I would say, Kuleana and myself, to understand that so that we can vote differently, we can make changes, we are informed in a deeper way. So I always find that a really useful question, and it was a good discussion in our class. So I just wanted to add that in.
Beautiful, beautiful. And as we are, you know, most of us, well, we're all in service to younger generations, right? So Pua, as the youngest person here, I'd love to open up a space and just invite you to share whatever thoughts you'd like to share as we close out our time together today.
Thanks, Matt. I think I'm just gonna share a little bit of what I've been talking about in our preps, and it's just having people who are a little, not by much, older than me, other Hawaiians, just creating space for us to talk about these things. That's not really common for me and my colleagues closer to my age to have spaces where we openly talk about healing, openly talk about trauma in a space that isn't chaotic. It's controlled, it's safe, and that has taught me a lot. And so I just want to mahalo all of you for creating the space to share stories and also teaching me how to create the space to tell my own stories. So I'll just end with that. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo Pua. That could not have been a more perfect and powerful ending to our time today. So thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you who's tuning in. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to enter into what we hope was a very different space than you're used to on a Friday afternoon. We hope that you were able to practice cultivating reflection through the listening to our stories, and hope that you were able to discover some common humanity in some of those stories that were shared. I'd love to invite you all and encourage you to continue to contemplate the interconnections and root causes of the climate crisis, of racism, of social inequity, the other isms that we are grappling with. And I hope that we have helped to shed some insights, even as we are learning and continue to grow in this ourselves, about the need to heal. We need to reconnect to the ways that we have been disconnected to ourselves, to each other, and to our Aina. And I would love to invite you all to look at the ways that you may have been disconnected yourself. And just know, final thought, know that truth, racial healing, and transformation is a process that is intended to help people reconnect, because climate crisis is a result of that disconnection. So with that said, mahalo to each of our panelists, Siobhán, Makana, Monica, and thanks everybody. Take good care of yourselves, take good care of each other. We hope.
Thank you everyone for coming.